Today is April 3, 2020, and it is day 8 of the national lockdown imposed by the South African government in an attempt to curb the spread of the 2019 coronavirus or COVID-19. My name is Helena Elof and I am an admitted attorney. I also work as a journalist, and I've gone through the effort of summarizing the regulations as they stand now after the most recent amendment on April 1. So this video is made for Caxton Local Media, and I really hope that it helps you to understand the gist of the regulations. I'm going to refer to my notes every now and then because, as you know, it is a massive load of information that we're dealing with. As you all know, the regulations urged government departments to do whatever they can to help limit the spread of the coronavirus, and the SAPS and SANDF have been asked to enforce the regulations. We're all homebound and we can only go out for the basic necessities such as food, emergency, medical care, or to go and get your social grant or pension. Essential workers are, however, allowed to travel, and we'll discuss the regulations as it comes to them in a while. If you are suspected of having the coronavirus and you are asked by an official to be tested, it is suggested that you comply, because those who don't will be placed in quarantine or isolation while an application is brought to court that they be forced to undergo the testing. So the best thing would be to comply if you're asked to do that. Criminal charges, as you know, may be the result of not adhering to the regulations as they now stand. The regulations state that no gatherings are allowed, but there are certain exceptions. Funerals is one of those exceptions, and this specific issue has been affected by the most recent amendment. We're now going to discuss that. No more than 50 people may attend a funeral, and night vigils are not allowed. We must take safety measures at funerals, such as regularly sanitizing and washing our hands and keeping social distancing, which currently they say is 1 square meter between yourself and the next person. So when can you travel across provincial lines for the purposes of a funeral? We know by now that the regulations limit us from traveling between metropolitan areas, district areas, or provinces. If you have to attend a funeral, however, you can be an exception if you are the spouse, partner, parent, grandparent, sibling, child, child-in-law, or a person closely affiliated to the person who died. What does it mean to be closely affiliated? One of two things. The first is that you either have parental responsibilities and rights in respect of the person who died, or secondly, if you had a significant relationship based on caregiving, psychological, or emotional attachment to the person who died. If you're one of those two types of persons, then you can also go to the funeral in another province. However, if you do that, you need to apply for an appropriate permit. You can do so at your local magistrate's office or at your local police station. What do you need to apply for such a permit? Firstly, you will need a copy of the death certificate of the person who died. If you cannot get hold of that, then you may use an affidavit. You can compile an affidavit, and the newest regulations set out exactly what that affidavit should look like. Now, this video is going to be embedded in a few Caxton Local Media news reports, and you can just scroll down and you will have access to the regulations, where you will find the exact affidavit and the application form that you need if you want to go to a funeral. If you have the permit, then you may only spend a maximum of 48 hours in the area where the funeral is, and while you're there you can stay with friends or family or a large hotel or guest house that has the appropriate permit as the regulations require. Other persons who may also cross provincial, district and metropolitan area lines are people who are going to and from work if they perform an essential service. This also includes those who transport cargo from points of entry to its intended destination. However, the sanitizing and disinfection of such cargo is very important. And then another exception is those who transport the body of someone who has passed away. However, just take note that if you are doing so, there may be a maximum of 2 persons who were close to the individual as stated in Sub-Regulation 8, which we just discussed. Another FAQ we get is, if I am an essential goods or service provider, how do I get a registration certificate confirming that from government? You'll have to go onto the Department of Trade and Industry's website. They have a portal where you apply and you will have to pay an application fee, and if successful, you will get your registration certificate. If you work for an essential goods or service provider, how can you ensure that you can move around freely for the purposes of work? You'll have to get a letter from that registered essential goods or service provider stating who you are, what you do, the fact that it's essential, and that you should therefore be able to move around freely. In addition to that letter from your boss or the owner of the company you work for, you should also be able to identify yourself. So also have your ID document or your driver's license with you at all times. Regarding tourists, the regulations have been amended. It still says that tourists should remain where they were at the time of lockdown. However, tourists may be evacuated if arrangements have been made by the relevant embassy. An example is the evacuation of tourists by air. Such tourists will be screened before they reach the exit point and board the airplane. This was allowed for some Brazilian and German tourists recently, you will recall. For most of us, public transport is prohibited. However, if you work for an essential goods or service provider, you may use public transport, but there are some serious limitations. If you use a bus or an e-hailing service, the passengers should not occupy more than 50% of the capacity of that vehicle. So that is for buses and e-hailing services such as Uber, for example. Safety measures must be adhered to in these vehicles, so all the passengers should keep their hands clean, maintain social distancing in as far as is possible, etc. Taxi services were previously limited to 50% of their capacity, but that has now been increased to 70%. Private motor vehicles that are used to transport those for essential goods or services purposes must only be filled to a maximum of 60% of its capacity, that is, private motor vehicles. 2 quick remarks that remain the same in terms of the regulations is that if an enforcement officer, that is, for example, someone from the SAPS or SANDF, instructs you to move from one location to another, then you should adhere to that. Government may also place you into self-isolation or isolation at a certain place or quarantine, and in that case, you should comply. Lastly, we can still not buy alcohol, we can still not go to bars, you still can't go to restaurants, and if you have alcohol, you should keep it at your own home, don't put it in your boot, and don't transport alcohol or consume it anywhere else than inside your home.